Might be uneven because I'm not used to using the mic much, so it might go up and down from time to time.
That's fine.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, JNU Academic, Dishi, and all others in JNU Academic for giving me this opportunity to be here. Some of you may know, some might not, that I have not been able to get access to a classroom full of people for a long time. So for me, the major part is to be able to be here and see if I still remember how to speak coherently in front of a classroom. So in case I falter, I will promise you that with practice it will get better. So now I am out of practice for some time. So, and thank you for Professor Sood and Professor Dasgupta for being here to talk about this. I will basically follow the guideline that very helpfully Professor Sood had provided. I didn't know how he's going to summarize, but I just found that it is the exact perfect way for me to get into it, the issue. The other thing is, can someone please remind me 5 minutes before the time, that because I am very, as some students who have taken my class would know, I'm very bad with that. So just so just stop me abruptly, like it's over. Okay, so I will be to some extent synoptic, because as Professor Sood has mentioned, it is a very rich work which addresses multiple different things. We agree, disagree, that's a different matter, but it is in its richness, in the vastness of its scope is mind-boggling to some extent. I would go to the extent of even claiming, and of course I'm partisan in this, so I am happy to be critiqued, that it is probably at least in the last quarter century in India, but most likely in the last 35 years since the the watershed period of 1990s of liberalization, even though, of course, liberalization and other things started much earlier, as Chiroshri's book has shown very helpfully earlier also. But if we look at the 91 as one of the watershed moments, since then, to think about Indian capitalism in particular, but about post-colonial capitalism in general, this has been the most generative work that at least I have come across. And this again, it's a big statement, as I am saying, that I'm happy to be critiqued on it, but it is the most generative theoretical work, conceptual work that we have come across, at least I have come across, in the last quarter century or maybe 35 years. Now there is an issue of speaking about conceptualization and theory. Somehow, given the way, and it is of course a result of our entire colonial history as well as the capitalist history of colonialism, that we in the third world, in the global south, are not expected to think or to conceptualize. We are expected to borrow from the knowledge that is produced in the metropolis and take it and then use it, apply it in terms of our specific context. Of course, there have been multiple, and we know I am not going to get into the detail of this, we can discuss it later. There have been path-breaking conceptual works that have been done from the global south over the centuries. It's not that, well, Sanyal comes for the first time, of course not, nothing like that. But since the last 35 years, the kind of change that has happened in India, in post-colonial capitalism, and in global capitalism as such, I think it would be difficult to come across such a bold, theoretical, conceptual refashioning, rethinking of the entire received wisdom about development. So, here I am not going to, of course, summarize or talk about exactly what Sanyal meant or he talked about. I know many of you would not be that acquainted with Sanyal's work, so that would have been also good to have, but given the format of the discussion, and what we have been told also, that this is revisiting Sanyal, not in terms of trying to understand Sanyal from the fresh thing in terms of reading the text itself. So, it is not to visit the text, but to visit with an appreciation as well as a critique. And to think about the current alignment, the current conjuncture in global capitalism. Now, this is one thing I want to flag, that Sanyal's book mostly deals with, and it does deal with, post-colonial capitalism and the specificity of India. In my revisiting, I would like to point out that probably, since this book has been written, the scope of the book has expanded to help us to think about the new conjuncture in global capitalism itself. Of course, it is about post-colonial capitalism in its own particularities, but also about other things. So, my approach here would be to try to reimagine, augment, to revive, but also to refigure Sanyal in particular ways. So, this is something that I wanted to say in the beginning, for those of you who might not be that acquainted with Sanyal's own thing. We can have discussion later if there are certain questions. So, given that, let me quickly now, with that introduction, get into the issues. So, a few more words about the actual issues and introductory approach to the actual issues that we are going to talk about. Of course, Sanyal's work have received huge reception in various circles in India and Global South, in the metropolis as well. But of course, interestingly, though not very surprisingly, the reception has been mostly from outside economics, not within the economics discipline per se. That is, I'm saying, not surprisingly, because of the state of affair in the discipline of economics itself. And including, I would say, within the critical approaches in the discipline of economics. So I will stick my neck out to argue that even within the critical approaches within economics, of course in mainstream economics we know the issues, but within the critical approaches also, it is not surprising that a work that deals with issues of political economy, of course, but goes back to the original roots, the ideas of political economy in terms of understanding the overall economy as composed of irreducibly, not only by the economy, but also by politics and culture. So the idea of the social, so political economy from Smith's time, Adam Smith's time. Of course, most of you would know that Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy, right? So there, it is not something like which is economics that was coming as such. So Sanyal goes back there and does it, and within mainstream economics, but also in its radical components of economics, we have shifted from that approach to for a long time. Now the question is, this huge reception that Sanyal has received, is it like also because the current conjuncture that we are in under capitalism that wants to celebrate these kinds of so-called radical works because it doesn't challenge the hegemony of capitalism so much? What I'm trying to say is that, of course, there are reasons why certain kinds of disciplinary changes happen, certain kinds of theories are accepted, celebrated, and certain kinds are not. There is an issue of power, political power, discursive power, and so on. So is it that this celebration of Sanyal is because it doesn't challenge the current orthodoxy or the current power of capital that much? I'm going to argue against that. I'm saying this because this has been one of the important critiques of Sanyal. That Sanyal, in his work, what he accomplishes may be very interesting, but what he accomplishes is by attacking and bringing down the power of counter-hegemonic work against capitalism, that is Marxian theories and other theories. And that's why maybe Sanyal is more celebrated than the other, that's why there is acceptance. I'm going to argue precisely against that critique as such. So, And the other thing that one needs to just keep in mind in terms of getting into this is the following. Sanyal, of course, like Professor Deshpande, when he wrote a critique or an appreciation of Sanyal's work in EPW earlier, had mentioned that it is very difficult to see a work by an economist where the bibliography starts with Aijaz Ahmed from A and ends with Zizek at Z. Like economists usually are not known to be reading such things as such. But at the same time, while they talks about, of course, various kinds of fashionable theories that have been there, I'm not saying fashionable to denigrate them. I'm saying that they are in circulation in that sense, not as a denigratory term. He deals with many of them, like starting from post-developmentalism, postmodernism, Gramscian, neo-Gramscian theory, indigeneity, post-colonialism in its simpler version, hybridity, and so on. In all of this, he makes his position to be different from what this particular quote-unquote fashionable things, which are not oftentimes liked by a particular version of radical theory. He differentiates his position from that. He is not into that thing. So one has to keep in mind while critiquing Sanyal in terms of this. Having said that, let me kind of jump in synoptically certain issues. Again, not to outline Sanyal, but what is important for us today in terms of looking at post-colonial capitalism and global capitalism. The first thing, so I will be synoptic, I will talk about very few things, like certain sentences, and I will be happy to come back and talk about it further later. First thing is the idea, the power of discourse, development discourse. Now this issue of development as such, we take it for given. Development means a particular thing, all of us have an idea, we almost all agree as if in terms of what is development. Sanyal argues, taking off from various other theories and particularly engaging with Gramsci and Foucault, that, and this is not a new argument, that the discourse has its own power. Now, in this particular context of looking at post-colonial capitalist development in our reality in India, South Asia, and other places here, he argues that what is taken as given in terms of our general popular understanding is an implication of not that this is the true meaning of development that we all agree upon, but a power, and for him, capital's power to make sure that this is how we talk about and look at development economics. Not just development economics, but the process of development itself. In other words, his first project, and which is very important for us here today, I think, is to politicize the issue of development. Sanyal argues that this particular kind of discursive power, which constructs a specific meaning about various theoretical concepts, about politics, about economy, that power serves a specific interest under capitalism that in various interesting ways serves the interest of capital's hegemony. So one should not approach a text or a discipline in terms of thinking, well, there is some new truth to be discovered there, but also one needs to read those texts in terms of how they work to re-establish or establish in newer ways the rule of capital over the rest of the society. So, this particular thing, the genealogy of development economics or development thought that Sanyal provides, we were used to, since we were his students and we were used to like talking about him in first name sometimes, so this is not to show disrespect to him. So, don't take it as a sign of disrespect as such. So what Sanyal does in terms of providing a rich genealogy of the evolution of development thought is to show how the changes in the discourse over the past 75 years, since its inauguration, roughly around the 1940s, particularly focusing on the work of Arthur Lewis and various other people. From there till today, what that particular evolution or that genealogy of development thought tells us about the changing rule of capital, changing nature of the rule of capital in our society, particularly in post-colonial realm. And since Sanyal passed away, unfortunately, like after his magnum opus, he would have probably been there to deal with various of the critics that were lodged against them, but he was not there, unfortunately, since he passed away very soon, like 3, 4, 5 years after the publishing of this text. We have kind of seen how this particular power of development, a particular way of thinking about the vast majority of people, how their living conditions improve, which development economics tries to do or claims to be doing. How that way of thinking, how to improve the conditions of living of the people, has continued in terms of the trajectory that he had mentioned. That is, we have seen recently, this year, the Nobel Prize in Economics have been won by the new institutionalists, Asimoglu and others. And before that, the last Global South people to get Nobel Prize in Economics was another development economics from the Global South, who was in terms of RCT, the randomized control trial, a particular way of thinking about economics itself. Now, what these kind of what is oftentimes referred to as new development economics, what these theories do in terms of serving a new hegemonic power of capital today to depoliticize development economics in a specific way has been more clear since his writing of the book and since his passing away. So this is one important issue that I think we need to keep in mind while reappreciating Sanyal's thing. That it has, what he was talking about in terms of the changes in the development economics, its genealogy, has now almost comes to more of a fruition. Very briefly, in like one sentence, the basic thing is to understand development economics and development practices that it generated since the 1940s for all the post-colonial nations was providing a particular vision to the people that it is possible to structurally overcome the barriers that we face ourselves in terms of the developing nations. In other words, under global capitalism, it is possible that all the laggards in the global economy, after some point of time, will be able to achieve what the global north, the parameters they have set for us, we will all be able to be rich. Of course, we come across that the talks about Vikshit Bharat and we will be the rich country in 20 years, 25, 30 years, whatever. Now, development economics, it is clear, Sanyal had shown it, but now with this new development economics, it has been absolutely clear that even as a discursive strategy, even as a theoretical strategy, it has given up on that hope. There is nothing big change to look forward to. What you can only do is go and see how you can be, every individual can be more efficient within the constraint that they are in and try to improve their life. Forget about that entire idea that there might be a full shift, a full transition to a new world order where all the laggards, the post-colonial nations, will be able to catch up with the developed world. This has very important implications also for development practices. Now, there had been a lot of debate, you would be knowing, those of you who are aware of Kullan's work, in terms of thinking about, one important part that he talks about was development practices, what they do is reverse the primitive accumulation of capital. Of course, there is a particular way one can, and in his book, I think it is problematic to some extent, the kind of language he uses as a reversal of primitive accumulation, but later on, actually one of the readings that were circulated in terms of his conversation with Chatterjee and others, and in some of his other interviews and works. He had very categorically said like what he was meaning was not a reversal of primitive accumulation, but reversal of the effects of primitive accumulation. Now, development practice, one can, of course, so if we make that particular argument, what is the importance of that particular argument? He is not claiming that capitalism today has understood that with ongoing primitive accumulation, they are going to produce this huge masses of people who are not getting anything from capital's rule and are going to come back and protest or take over the control of the society. That capital has understood that, and that's why they are stopping the primitive accumulation process. Not that. He is talking about how, through the development practices, the effects of this is sometimes overturned. And again, in today's context, I would urge you to think about how is it possible that something like the UBI scheme, the Universal Basic Income Scheme, could get such a huge legitimacy. This surplus, to a certain extent, is given back to all the people if it is universal, so that they can have certain minimum resources to eke out their conditions of living. How is it that if it is not an attempt to reverse the effects of primitive accumulation, then how to think about it otherwise? This is not just, it is the mainstreaming of the issue. It is not simply the mainstreaming of the issue. What I am saying is that this has now been talked about in the government documents, in the government budgets, in the economic service, by the World Bank, all over. So Sanyal's insight there becomes even more important in terms of today's time. The other thing I would like to point out is in terms of, may I have 5 minutes? Yeah. The other things that I want to just mention briefly is in terms of the idea of decolonialism, which is again a huge kind of acceptance across in academia nowadays. Now, Sanyal's particular warning to us about what this decolonialization means and how it can be appropriated for the rule of capital, again today becomes more and more visible to us in terms of what the mainstreamization of the decolonial theory, by taking away its fangs, by taking away its critical powers, what it has achieved. But most importantly, that's why I asked for like 2-3 minutes more, most importantly what I would like to talk about is Sanyal's involvement with Marx and Marxian theory, Marxian politics. I would posit that against the general critical wisdom, Sanyal's thing should not be read as being orthogonal to Marx, as against Marx per se, but a specific critique of certain particular readings of Marx that have hegemonized our thinking for a long period of time. Particularly in terms of the issues of teleology, in terms of the issues of economic reductionism, in terms of the issues of how to look at the role of cultural, political and economic coming together to produce our social reality, and so on. In this regard, what he does is moves out of, and this is an important change in the way of looking at radical politics and radical political economy in the academia, is in terms of giving up on that idea of transition that had informed both the mainstream development theory as well as the radical critics, as well as in terms of the radical practice. In this regard, certain things, 4 things I'm just going to mention and stop here, which we can come back revisit later. One, the idea from the Marxian tradition, so all these issues are coming from the Marxian tradition, the idea of the working class, and how do we think in terms of the working class in today's time, in today's global capitalism, in terms of also the laboring population. The two things are not similar all the time. from the Marxian lineage, from the Marxian genealogy, the idea of the working class that is produced as the one who is going to be the flag bearer of the change, of the social change, that gets complicated in terms of the current conditions of global capitalism. So it's not simply a post-colonial feature, but in terms of global capitalism as such. In terms of global capitalism, how to think about the huge difference that has happened in terms of the what we understood as the characteristics of the global south and the characteristics of the advanced capitalist countries of the global north. That particular understanding of how to posit the global north as different from global south, that has undergone, I would argue, a huge change since Anyal's book, since 2007 till now, and which basically provides a better engagement and better appreciation of Anyal's critique. The idea of then, from there comes the difference or the similarity between working class and laboring population. From there comes the political manifestation of it, the idea of populism. The idea of populism, both from its right-wing variety and from its left-wing variety. As we have seen just yesterday, we have found President Trump coming back to power in the US. And you'll remember in 2016 when Trump came to power, and then also just before that, around that Brexit had happened. In 2017, the Times magazine had a article, the front page article, which I used to show in my classes, that is the Times magazine, the liberal icon, the liberal capitalist icon, arguing that the conditions of our world are now same as the condition that Lenin found the world to be in 1917, coming from the Times magazine. And that basically shows the particular changes in global capitalism which has given rise to this political, ideological phenomenon of populism, which again is related to the realm of production and circulation in particular ways that from Anyal's work we can productively find. In other words, finally I'll end with this, Anyal's work seen in this particular way, both in terms of the discursive formulation, the discursive critique, the new changes in the discourse, its power, and then to the most magnificent critique of the capitalist system that we know so far. Again, this is my own partisan position, Marxism. How Marxism deals with this particular changes. Anyal, and then from there, what kind of anti-capitalist politics follows today, given this new conjuncture of capitalism since 2007-8, after the great crisis of 2007-8. This particular conjuncture, how to deal with that, Anyal's work provides, for me at least, and for many of us, the most generative framework to think about, not in terms of a Kuhnian paradigm as such, but more in terms of a central text to formulate a Lakatosian research program, and also to activate it in the ground in terms of radical anti-capitalist politics. I know I have not gone into any of the details of this. This is more to provoke the discussion. We'll come back to it later. Thank you.